Jen said, I'll be talking about Siri shortcuts for about the next 25 minutes. And we're going to talk about it because it's a new feature in iOS 12, so it's something that we might all be getting asked, should we be adding it to our apps? So what I really want you to take away today is, what's a Siri shortcut? What kind of tasks do they work for? When does the user experience make sense? And then if you think of something where it does make sense that you will want to add one, go through a bit of the technical options for implementing them. There's two completely different ways to go about it. And I'd like to save you the details of going way down the wrong path only to find out that you should have completely done it the other way. If you've dealt with some voice chat, chatbots, Alexa intents, maybe things like that before, you might be surprised at some of the differences with Siri shortcuts. In some ways, they're far more limited. They're essentially access to features in your app, mapping from a single voice command for the user. So the user says something specific, a single phrase that they've chosen, and your app does something specific. So they're not giving you a bunch of parameters. You're not parsing out a whole bunch of details of their coffee order. They're saying, order my coffee, and your app is ordering a tall vanilla latte. In addition to being able to access them by talking to Siri with a voice command, kind of for free along with that, you also get your shortcuts shown on the lock screen, in search suggestions, a tiny little bit of work on the watch face, even if you don't have a watch app. And as well, they're accessible through CarPlay, and in iOS 12, there'll be a shortcuts app. If you're a geeky developer, you might have played with the old Workflows app. It's essentially the same thing, just getting a lot more promotion, and we'll probably see a few more people using it. But you'll be able to string together a series of shortcuts, and certainly given this, with a lot more apps exposing shortcuts, it'll be more useful for anyone who wants to play with it. From a user experience perspective, if you think about the kind of things you say to Siri today, you kind of always ask them. You might say, what's the weather? Order me a car to the airport. There's not a lot of things that we ask Siri that you couldn't do at 3 in the morning, or that you couldn't do on a random Saturday, or you couldn't do on a holiday. And it's the same idea for Siri shortcuts. You want to pick things in your app that are always available, always accessible, and that are always going to be useful to the user. And things that they're going to want to do more often. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to set up a shortcut for something you're going to want to do one-off, because once you've set up your account, something like that, it's just not that useful to do it again. But the big benefit of shortcuts is acceleration. The whole point is to save users time and mental effort. When you're talking to Siri and you're going on and saying, hey, Siri, order my coffee, and the app doesn't have to open and show you the screen, you don't have to pull out your phone and look down and deal with that, that saves you context switch, and it's a heck of a lot quicker. So when you're looking for things in your app that might make sense as shortcuts, something that people are going to want to do possibly frequently, repeatedly, and where they really don't want the cognitive overhead and the time and effort to actually open your app and stare at stuff. From the user's perspective, what will happen when they deal with shortcuts is, first, they'll do something in your app. So you can't start with a shortcut. You can't ship an app that immediately recognizes the voice command in Siri. The user has to go into your app and do something. So if we say we're going to do that coffee order, and I go in, and as I have every morning, every workday for the last forever, I order my tall vanilla latte. At that point, the app might offer me the option to add that shortcut to Siri on my device. By default, I'd actually have to go into the Settings app, dig into Siri, and find the shortcut there. Optionally, highly recommended, you can add UI to your app, so it's much easier for the user to do it there. But so on, say, the confirmation screen for my coffee order, I might get a little button that says, hey, add this as a Siri shortcut. I tap that, get a single-page UI that pops up, and it'll say, now this is what you're adding a shortcut for. Tap the button and tell Siri what you want to say to do this. And the developer can provide a suggestion. So it might say, you could say something like, order my coffee. But you can hit that button and you can say, caffeine fix. You can say, I need morning time now. You can say anything you want there. And the developer doesn't get to define what the user is going to use at that point. And that's the one-to-one mapping. So that specific task that they did that's fully defined, order a tall vanilla latte, is mapped to that single order my coffee phrase. From that point on, whenever they're talking to Siri, they can go in and use that phrase again, order my coffee, and your app will repeat that task that they originally did when they offered to add the shortcut. There's a few optional points that might happen that might make sense for your app. You can have a confirmation step, and if I'm ordering my coffee and it's going to process a payment for me, I probably want Siri to make sure that it got the right shortcut and it's going to order the right thing for me, so I'll add a confirmation step. And really nice, you can add some custom UI. So historically, this has been available for Apple apps like weather, and you get a nice little page, kind of just a little widget that you can configure as custom UI for your shortcut. So that's what shortcuts are, a little bit of an idea of what kind of tasks they might make sense for, what kind of user experience they might fit for. So if you thought about that, and there's places in your apps where, yeah, a shortcut would be a really nice enhancement for what we were doing. We'll look a bit now at what are your implementation options. And there's two completely different ways of doing it. One is NS user activity, which is something that's been around for a while. You might be using it for handoff or some Siri search enhancements. And there's INintent, which is relatively new, and all the handling for shortcuts is totally new stuff. And NS user activity is kind of a bookmark or a breadcrumb. So as the user's going through your app, they reach a certain point, and you say, create an NS user activity that represents this state of the app. And then later on, the app gets restored from handoff from a search result, or now from a shortcut, to go right back to that state, and to go essentially back to that bookmark or breadcrumb to reproduce that. And INintent is far more flexible. So as you may have noticed earlier, I was saying, it's great you never have to open the app. With an NS user activity, you do, because it's just bringing you back to a certain point. With an INintent, you can execute in the background, do the nice little custom UI in Siri, all that. So most of the time, for maximal value, for the best experience, you probably want an INintent. But if you already have NS user activities in your app, or the shortcut that you're dealing with is something like, show me the daily specials. And it's something where you're really just trying to save the user a bunch of navigation and configuration in the app to get to a specific point. NS user activity-based shortcuts are super easy to implement. There's way less going on there. So let's look a bit at what the code looks like for both of those. And I guess for INintent, it's kind of a few steps and then some code. So if you dealt with user activities, you create them, give them titles, set content attributes. That would be like your search keywords, things like that. If you're going down this path, any old tutorials, anything like that, will be totally up to date, except for the new little bits for shortcuts. So you can go through an old tutorial on how to set up handoff, and then just add the shortcut stuff, and it should be fine. What's new is this is eligible for prediction property. So setting that to true is what says this specific NS user activity can be used as a shortcut with Siri. By default, it's false. So if you've got existing shortcuts and you just want to make them a Siri thing, then you can just go and turn that on. And the only other thing you have to do there is set the suggested invocation phrase. And that's what pops up in that little UI. You get a single view controller to show the user when they're adding the shortcut to suggest this is the kind of phrase you might want to use, like please my coffee order or whatever. I'm guessing what happened is Apple discovered that if you throw a screen up at a user and say, hey, say something, nobody knows what to say. If you tell them, hey, this, you might say something like this, then they're fine. Finally, you have to set the user activity to the current user activity on the view controller that you're on, or if it's not kind of a view controller point of your app, you can use activity.becomeCurrent. And that's the point where the operating system is told, this activity is being done here and now, and that's the information that Siri is going to use to make predictions about when to offer this as a search suggestion, pop it up on the watch, and do that kind of extra stuff for recommending when to use it. To actually handle these things, when the user does execute the shortcut, does invoke the intent, essentially, you have one function in your app delegate that'll get used. And that's application continue user activity restoration handler. At that point, you get handed back NS user activity that should essentially represent the same stuff that you set up initially. And you just get to do whatever to restore your app back to that point to give the user what they want. And as I mentioned earlier, it will open the app. These shortcuts can't be used for background stuff. contrast to that, IN implementation is a lot more than, if you already had NS user activity set up, that's 2 lines of code you have to add, and that's it. I will point out at the end a few little optional things. You probably want to do some of those as well, but strictly speaking, 2 lines of code to add it. The IN implementation, it's done as a couple of targets. So you want to make sure for your app that you have the Siri capability enabled, and then you go in and add an intent extension. There's an option at that point to add an intent UI extension. In fact, there's actually just a little checkbox. You don't have to add the 2 targets separately. It's kind of a checkbox like if you're adding unit tests when you start a project. Once you've done that, it will give you a new intent.intent definition file, which is kind of an ugly, stupid form. Looks a lot like setting up a core data model. But you'll open that up, you'll add a new intent, give it a title, give it a description, give it a category. If you're one of the few people who's been lucky enough to deal with INintents a bit before this, they were extremely limited, and there were only a handful of use cases like ride-sharing orders that you were allowed to use them for previously. Now there's 30 or 40 categories, and they include things like share, do, post, tons of stuff. So whatever type of task you're trying to model, you can get that properly shown to the user that, yeah, there's a category that fits. At the level of the intent, you decide whether or not to have a confirmation step. So one thing that's not necessarily always obvious is a single intent might have multiple shortcuts associated with it. So for my order my coffee intent, I might have order my coffee, which orders my morning tall vanilla latte, and I need a caffeine fix, which orders me a double espresso. And both of those can be represented by a single intent. They're basically doing the same thing with a few parameters that are different. The caveat is that if I want a confirmation step for one of those, I have to have a confirmation step where Siri asks me, hey, you sure you want to do that? For both of those, which is fine for the 2 coffee orders. That's great. But if I had another step that show me the daily, or another shortcut to show me the daily specials, I don't want a confirmation step for that. So in that case, I'd have to model that as a separate intent. You've got that set up. You can set up your parameters, and that's kind of the inputs. You can think of them the input arguments if an intent was a function. So tall vanilla latte, size, type, flavor, be kind of parameters that you would set up there. There's a handful of types that are available, strings and numbers, things like that, locations. There's an array of option for your parameter, so you can use a set. And if you look at the WWDC videos and the demos, they use a set of ingredients that are toppings on soup. And you can pick all or none of those as one of the parameters. That's a good example to look at for that kind of stuff. The parameters are essentially all optional. But what you define, as opposed to saying, OK, I always need to know what size coffee they're ordering, is what combinations of parameters are acceptable. So I said tall vanilla latte. If I have a flavor, a size, and a type, I can order a coffee. If I have a size and a type, that's probably enough. So I'm going to tell them I'm just ordering a double espresso. We're going to confirm that. No worry about missing anything there. But I could also have a combination of parameters that's an empty set. Just order a coffee. At that point, I may not know how to complete that order entirely. And so for that parameter combination, I can actually turn off the background execution and force the app to open for just that case. So confirmation, you have to pick for is an all or none thing for all of the different cases that your intent will handle, whether or not it can execute in the background, case by case based on your parameters. Last thing to set up there is the responses, and that's what Siri is going to say back to the user after things are done, or in the case of an error. Properties are just another little entry thing like parameters. Super easy setup, just go in and name them, and they're for passing data back from your code into what Siri is going to say as a response. So if I wanted the success case to tell the user your coffee will be ready in 8 minutes, I'd set up a wait time parameter, probably make it a string to keep life easy, and pass back 8 minutes. And then the response template, your coffee will be ready in wait time, will get populated with that success case. So once you've dealt with the stupid, ugly form and set up all the little nooks and crannies of it, Xcode will go off and do a little bit of code generation for you. The first thing you want to concern yourself is it will create an intent handling protocol, and in this case, I've called it just my custom intent handling. This is in the intent extension. It's not in your main app. that you will need to implement a class that implements that protocol. You'll have one or two functions to deal with there. You'll always have a handle function. You'll have a confirm function if you have confirmation turned on for your intent. And they're both very similar functions. They just hand you the intent, and you call a completion handler with an intent response when you're done. The intent responses are generated from those response templates. So you've got the generic ones that don't have any placeholders, like my custom intent response.failure, which is just whatever template string that you put in for a failure case. And on the very bottom, there's an example of what if I wanted to pass in something like the wait time. So in that case, the code generation would give you a parameter that you can input as an argument into that to be able to populate that success case. So that's where I'd pass in 8 minutes as a wait time, and it would fill that in for me. To note, though, that obviously your shortcut's something that the user did in your main app, and now you're handling this in the extension. You need to make sure that you have access to the code and the functionality to do that in both of those targets. So Apple recommends using a framework, but that is something that you do have to deal with. You then have to switch back to your main app, and annoyingly, even if you've set up background execution for all of your shortcuts, the users always have a way to get into the app and open it at any point. For example, if you use custom UI and they tap on the custom UI, it will open the app, and it won't complete the background execution for the intent. So you have to do exactly the same handling in the app delegate that you had for the NS user activity case, where you get handed the intent, and it actually even packs it inside of an NS user activity. So you can mix the two types very easily by disambiguating them here. So do that, handle it, restore whatever state you need to for them. Finally, the thing that we did with the NS user activity that we haven't done here is tell the operating system, tell Siri about this. So it's a bit of an odd terminology, but Apple's calling it donating the intent. And that's when you say, this intent is something that the user is doing right now. You want to do that every time they perform the task in the app. And that's where the operating system gets the information about when to make the recommendation. So I'm in the habit of pulling out my phone, ordering my coffee every morning. I'm probably going to keep doing that for a while and not realize about the shortcut. So every morning when I do that, as I place the order, as it succeeds, then I, inside the app, just create an intent, create an interaction, and donate it. And after a few days of doing that, Siri will realize, hey, she orders coffee when she's about to leave the house at 8:45 every morning. And that's when it'll start popping up as a suggestion. That will be really annoying to test. Fortunately, if you have the developer profile set up on your device, you can go into the developer menu within settings and set it up so that instead of giving you smart suggestions, Siri just shows you whatever the last donated intents were, so that you can go through and test that flow out. So that's the core things you have to do, but there's definitely some user experience that's lacking there. In particular, in that case, you'd have to go into settings and add the shortcuts. And you and I might do that, but nobody else is going to find that buried 3 pages into the settings app. Luckily, there's a really nice, dead simple class to pop up called INUI Add Voice Shortcut View Controller. And it is exactly what it sounds like. It's a view controller that you give it an intent, pop it up, and it lets the user know what kind of shortcut they're setting up, and give that voice command and finish adding that shortcut to Siri right in your app. There's a counterpart to it, INUI Edit Voice Shortcut View Controller, so if they have one and they want to change it, you can also allow them to do that directly in your app. You should absolutely use that, and you can use it for NS user activity as well. It's not just an INintent thing. Most of the other fancy niceties only apply to INintent. For the custom UI, as I mentioned earlier, that's a third target, so Intent's UI extension, which is a very simple target. It gives you a storyboard, set up whatever UI you want, and there's a single configure function that hands you, here's the views from your storyboard, here's the intent, make it look the way it should, throw it up on the screen. The significant limitation for custom UI is that there is no user interaction available. They tap on it, you'll get your app launched. So you can't do anything cool with buttons or interaction or anything fun there. If you want your shortcuts to show up on the watch, then you have to give it a little bit more information. At this point, it won't just guess that you order coffee when you're leaving the house at 8:45 in the morning. When you do the donation, you should also set up an IN relevant shortcut, which is this is something that's done once a day, or this is something that's location-based, or something that's time-based, to give a bit of information there. And as I mentioned earlier, you don't need to have your own watch app for that to work. It'll work right on the watch in and of itself. Tiny little detail, but it actually turns out to be really nice, is every time you donate an intent, you can set an image and a title. So although you can set them in the form, and the image will default to your app's icon if you don't set one, you can set different ones for different intents and even for different sets of parameters and their values. So I can set it up so that my double espresso intent shows a different little espresso cup compared to my big, tall, stereotypical coffee, tall vanilla latte. So give the user a nice visual thing, and particularly if they're seeing that as a suggestion, reading the tiny little text is kind of annoying and useless, but seeing a nice different visual representation of those is wonderful. So those are the optional but highly recommended things to do if you're going down the path of adding shortcuts to your app. So that was an awful lot in about 20 minutes of what Apple actually put together in about 4 videos that are almost an hour long each. So if you're digging back in the WWDC videos, 202 is kind of general introduction stuff. 211 to 14 are the real meat potatoes of the details. 217 is the watch stuff. There's not much in this year's WWDC videos on the custom UI. Fortunately, it's almost exactly the same as the search extension stuff that was done last year. So if you dig into last year's What's New in Siri kit, that'll be really great for you. The documentation's pretty good. The beta docs are essentially up to date. They've been keeping up with them. There's a nice demo app. They're lovely for knowing if you missed something when you're setting things up and all the different bits and pieces you have to get together. They're kind of awful if you're trying to figure out what do I need to do next to get this working. So I've just highlighted a blog post that someone wrote, just a random Medium post, that is a really nice step through an example of this, and it does background execution, custom UI, and in fact makes a network call as part of the population of the UI that's being dealt with within Siri. So it goes and fetches an image and displays it. So that's what I've got today, and hopefully you have a bit of an idea of whether or not Siri shortcuts are something that are going to work for your app, or whether the limitations are too big of a thing to really suit at this point, and an idea of how you would go and start implementing those so that you don't end up too far down the wrong path and have to double back later on. Thanks.